Hey, it's Justin Harvey. Thanks for tuning in to the Anesthesia Success Podcast, where we take a close look at important topics pertaining to business, practice management, personal finance, and careers for anesthesiologists and pain management physicians. On this show, I work hard to take your critical questions straight to the experts. Thanks for listening. This week, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Berend Mets to talk about the global crisis in anesthesia access. Over 5 billion people globally, that's billion with a B, do not have access to safe anesthesia care, and this is causing a huge impact, not only from a human level, but also economically. And Dr. Mets is doing a lot of great work with a number of organizations that I'm really excited to discuss with him today. Thanks for tuning in. Hello and welcome to episode 41 of the Anesthesia Success Podcast. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Berend Mets. Dr. Mets is professor and chair of anesthesiology and perioperative medicine at Penn State University College of Medicine here in my home state of PA. He also serves as director on the board of the World Federation Societies of Anesthesiologists, as well as being the chair of the Global Humanitarian Outreach Committee of the ASA. Berend, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
And I'm really excited to dig into this topic of global access to anesthesia. So I recently read this article which you penned at Kevin MD talking about the statistic that grabbed my eyeballs was 5 billion people globally don't have safe access to anesthesia. So I'm really looking forward to unpacking your experience in the context of global anesthesia.
Right. And so, the statistics are stark. So the Lancet Commission, which is a commission that's launched by the Lancet Journal, proposed a commission to look at the state of anesthesia and surgery around the world in 2010. And their findings were that while there are about 4 million people that die from infectious disease around the world, there are 16 million, i.e. 4 times the amount, that die from lack of access to surgery and anesthesia.
Wow. This
is a terribly stark statistic. And they went on further to say that of the 7 billion people in this world today, 5 billion lack access to a successful surgery and anesthesia, which has a huge problem for, of course, those individuals in terms of an increased mortality. And while there are around 300,000 surgeries performed a year, just 6% of those occur in the low and middle income countries where this access problem is.
Wow. So tell us a little bit about your background, because I know you've trained in Europe and South Africa, and I'm sure that has contributed to your global perspective.
It very much has. I was born in Indonesia of Dutch parents. I'm originally Dutch, and my father delivered me of my mother, in fact, in a bush hospital in Indonesia. And after 6 weeks, I was on my first plane. And since that, I've traveled to 80 countries.
Wow.
Traveled and worked literally all over the world. I grew up in Indonesia, in Singapore, in the West Indies, in England, in Holland. And eventually, my parents settled in South Africa, where I trained in medicine and then also started anesthesia. I happened upon anesthesia.
Okay.
In South Africa, you have to be a medical officer before you can specialize. And I thought, well, let me try this anesthesia stuff. And so in a very large KwaZulu-Natal hospital, I started anesthesia. And it was just so thrilling and so exciting that I thought this is what I will make my career out of.
Got it. Was your father also a physician?
He was, in fact. He was also a general physician. And in those days, of course, they did surgery and they gave anesthesia as well with ether.
Okay.
And so really, I started anesthesia in a very rudimentary environment with a finger on the pulse and a blood pressure cuff. And I actually write of many of these histories that I'm about to relate, if asked, in my book, Waking Up Safer, an Anesthesiologist Record, where I use my life as an example of how anesthesia has actually progressed over the years. And so my first anesthetic was given in KwaZulu-Natal. I was scared stiff as I thought, I'm going to kill this patient. I fortunately didn't. And my career took off after that.
Got it. Excellent. So we're going to link to that in the show notes. So that book, Waking Up Safer, if you go to anesthesiasuccess.com/41, you'll be able to link there to Berend's book, Waking Up Safer. And so this set you on this trajectory of being a global citizen, as
Yes.
well as an expert clinician in anesthesia. Talk about how your perspective, your desire to prioritize global access to anesthesia as part of your life's work evolved.
So it's almost like going home, if you will understand, from starting off in Indonesia and then starting with very rudimentary anesthetic techniques, because South Africa, like so many low and middle income countries around the world, has basically two-tier medical systems. There's the university private practice systems, which are highly functional and modern. And then there's the secondary rural systems, which is very rudimentary. And that's often where many of the problems do occur in terms of access and in terms of mortality, which is a huge issue. But I'll get to that. So I started in one of those lower access environments. And so, but I was, of course, and trained in, super specialist hospital, Groote Hospital in Cape Town. Mm-hmm. But during my training, I already started volunteering. So we went out with a group to do cleft palate surgery and anesthesia. Of course, you need that for that. In Lesotho, which is inbounded by South Africa borders. And so that's really where I started as I was a young resident, or registrar, as we call those in South Africa. And then it really progressed as I advanced, of course, in the clinical sense in one of the top hospitals in the world, the Columbia University, where I started in anesthesia in the States. It progressed, and I started feeling that I would like to contribute to global health as well as being able to understand how we do it at the top centers in the world. I have a very deep understanding and appreciation for how it can be done in less resource environments. And that's really where I started getting involved. And I got involved with the World Federation Societies of Anesthesiologists. I'm now on the board there for the last 22 years or so, working on various committees, going to various countries, Vietnam, China, going to lecture, and in other countries, again, providing clinical services.
Got it. And would you say, were there any, as you look back, especially in those early years, were there any experiences that stand out in your mind where you were maybe helping a patient or working in a small clinic or something and saying, this experience, this past couple of days has made me realize I want to really put my weight behind and my effort behind building pathways to global anesthesia access?
I guess it would probably be that first trip to Lesotho when I was really, a young resident, and I was came out of course, a university hospital to a less sophisticated environment. Mm-hmm. It was great fun. They flew us out there in a private jet, which was great. Wow. and then we got to do a lot of complex surgery, obviously on craniofacial types of surgery, cleft palates. And the anesthesia is such an integral part of the success of these patients, and you get to see these patients, and also you see the effects of your work. We see this generally anyway in the first world, but it's almost as if in the developing world, now we call the low and middle income countries, it's so much more appreciated what you do. And I think that probably is part of how I got into this even more. It's truly appreciated what we do. And we can do so much more, so that's one of the reasons I got into that.
Yeah. So you're currently, among your other leadership roles, the chair of the ASA's Global Humanitarian Outreach Committee. As we mentioned right before we jumped on the call here with Dr. Anna Crawford, who's been a past guest of this show. Talk a little bit about the initiatives that this ASA committee has undertaken to try to expand global access.
Well, one of the most important things is that we have done is try to advocate for the global anesthesia crisis that I just witnessed in my previous statements. That's the first thing, but it's not enough to just talk about it. The other thing is that you have to put plans and implement plans. And so what we've done is we've focused in a number of different areas. The first is to extend the work of the Overseas Training Program. So the Overseas Training Program was really a program to help build capacity around the world, launched by the ASA, by going to certain countries and then helping support the training locally. And this has had a storied history since 1991. So the current committee was renamed from the Overseas Training Program to the Global Humanitarian Outreach Committee. And we've continued that work in two countries, in Guyana and in Rwanda. Now, in Rwanda, Dr. Crawford is in charge of helping support their residency training program in Rwanda. And we've been very successful. So we collaborate with the Canadian Society, and the American Society of Anesthesia in building residency training programs in those different countries. In Rwanda, we've been quite successful, and we've been there for approximately 8 years. And we now have graduates from that program that are now training their own residents back into the system in Rwanda. So that sets up the virtuous cycle of a self-sustaining process of building anesthesia capacity in a particular country. So that's one area we've been involved in. And then the other one we have launched over the last 4 years is in Guyana, South America.
Got it. What are the biggest challenges that you're facing as part of this committee towards either maintaining current programs or perhaps expanding them to other places?
So it's always crucial whenever you start any program that you have a very strong local champion. And because it all ultimately rests on their shoulders, and the momentum that's created has to be sustained by a local champion. Otherwise, it isn't sustainable and it can't grow from there. So in Guyana, we have Dr. Alex Harvey. So I met Dr. Alex Harvey some years ago when I was involved again on the Global Humanitarian Outreach Committee, just as a foot soldier, not as a chair, in development of the LifeBox program. So LifeBox, as many of you probably know, is a pulse oximeter program, which basically sought to bridge the gap of operating rooms around the world where there were no pulse oximeters. This was created through the WFSA, also through the Harvard Medical School and a few others, the AAGBI of England. And from that came this LifeBox, this physical box, yellow box, which is a pulse oximeter.
Got it.
As part of this program, we distributed LifeBox pulse oximeters around the world, but people had to be trained on using this new technology because they hadn't been trained with this. So the ASA-GHO committee sent out people to different countries, not only to present individuals with this LifeBox, but also to train them on how to use this pulse oximeter. And so I was in Guyana together with a few other ASA volunteers, and we were launching this LifeBox program with Alex Harvey. So Alex Harvey was the local champion. She's a Guyanese, English-trained anesthesiologist, and she was helping coordinate this LifeBox program for her country.
Got it. And how did you first come in contact with Dr. Harvey?
Well, I was referred to her because, as I said, what we always need to do is find a good local champion, somebody who's interested in helping develop a program within their own country. And she is particularly motivated because she wanted to create her own residency training program, which didn't exist or was in a very nascent form in Guyana, in Georgetown, which is the capital of Guyana. Guyana is a small country, about 800,000 people. So it's not a big country. I mean, it's a massive country, but very sparsely populated. And so we met by email, of course, initially, but subsequently we became friends. And when I was there for that first time, she said, I need your help. I want to start a residency program. She had that vision. And so when I became the chair of the ASA-GHO committee, I decided that I would try and figure out a way how we could potentially build an overseas training program with her in Guyana. And so we have done that. And we now have 4 successful years behind us with graduating residents who are now faculty within that department, training the residents, setting up this virtuous cycle again.
Awesome. So I am a finance guy, so I'm hearing all the things you're talking about and thinking, this is really interesting, but I know that flying all over the place and creating, educational programs for young physicians in other countries costs a lot of money. So I'm curious, how are these endeavors funded, and with what other organizations do you partner to do this?
Yes, so the American Society of Anesthesia has been very generous with this, and realizing the need, the crying need out there, and also realizing that we need to build capacity. We need to train the trainers, basically. And so the American Society of Anesthesia supports both of these 2 programs, as I said, in Rwanda and Guyana. And we do this in collaboration with the Canadian Society. Okay. And so together we fund the support for the volunteers to go out there, to fly there and to stay there. So that's part of the way we support that. it's actually very difficult to get donations for programs. I'm the director of partnerships for the World Federation and on the board. Mm-hmm. And part of my job is to try and get the donation support for programs to the World Federation. And it is a tall order. It's very difficult because people do not understand the concept and the importance often of anesthesia. You know, with this hidden specialty, we work quietly behind the scenes. Yeah. And as I just talked about the access in the Lancet Commission, it's only now that people are realizing how important essential surgery and anesthesia is to the world community. Yeah, I would like to translate this for you into economic terms because you're an economist. Yeah. So the Lancet Commission reported that, and the commission was basically the 220 Commission, and was projecting out the lost cost that would occur over the next 10 years, 220 to 2030, of not implementing the plans for essential surgical and anesthesia services around the world. In lost economic costs in terms of people being disabled, say a club foot that isn't being prepared, or die as a C-section that can't occur because there's no surgery, no anesthesia, and the patient dies, as $12.3 trillion in lost economic costs across the world. And what it would need is a $3 billion investment to provide 143 million surgeries needed a year to avoid this. So I think I've given you some idea of the scope of the problem and also the potential solution. But I'll talk a lot more about the potential solution if you would.
Yeah, so I just want to play that back for a second to make sure I understand. So the Lancet Commission recommended a $3 billion with a B dollar investment over the next 10 years to create the infrastructure necessary to save, did you say 12 trillion with a T?
12.3 trillion.
Dollars of lost economic impact through surgeries that either go wrong or people don't have access to.
Well, yes. So, for example, somebody has a maimed arm from trauma and it can't properly be prepared. And so they are removed from the workforce. Yeah. That's a good example.
Yeah. You know? So these numbers are so compelling. I mean, if we look at it in investment terms, we have this phrase ROI, return on investment. If we could spend $3 billion to save 12 trillion, that sounds like a slam dunk. So I'm wondering, you know, in the context of your role as the director of partnerships, when you have these numbers in your back pocket, why do you think it is that it's difficult to raise funds for this kind of work?
Well, you know, because numbers often don't speak to people.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
It's stories that speak to people, you know, and so that's right. what we tried to do through the World Federation and also the ASA GHO committee. Yeah, is tell stories, success stories of the many programs that we deliver literally around the world. I've just told you about the 2 programs for the ASA GHO committee. The other one that I just wanted to illustrate as well for that committee is particularly for our residents in America. We created the Resident International Anesthesia Scholarship over the last 4 years again. And this is an opportunity competitively to apply for 6 spots a year for senior residents to go to 3 sites, cure hospital sites around the world, one being in Ethiopia, which is where I have been and I can talk cogently about, but there in a pediatric hospital under supervision, we have the opportunity for residents to rotate a month. And as part of this Resident International Anesthesia Scholarship, it's done extremely well. We now have already 40 graduates from this program, American residents that have become faculty. And many of them are now on a number of them are now on our GHO committee. I mean, they were inspired often by this program. And that's another way that we built a global interest, or a particular interest in our own country here in America, of residents coming in and volunteering and supporting global health.
Yeah. What is the resident experience like as participants in that program?
Well, they tell me that it's great. So it's a pediatric orthopedic hospital. I've been there. It's a lovely place. And of course, they collaborate with their Ethiopian resident colleagues in the same hospital. So it's a mutual exchange, which works very well. But they also help train nurses there in anesthesia as well. So they are also trainers. They're trained to be trainers. And of course, they're working in less intensively resourced environment. And that is a whole new set of skills that people need to develop. And this is why we always have senior residents go there. I found it that, a junior resident just hasn't got the wherewithal yet to do this. And that's why we not only encourage, we mandate that they are senior residents.
Got it. So that you just used a phrase there that I want to key in on, and it's solving problems in under-resourced environments. So you mentioned in your Kevin MD article that sometimes you have these complex problems where you're resource constrained, and you are sometimes able to, whether it's an administrative issue, a systems issue, or even like a clinical issue, that you're able to work through, troubleshoot, and solve these problems with a straightforward and simple solution.
Yeah.
So can you give maybe a couple examples or stories of how that's been so?
Yes, so I'll tell the story that I said in Kevin MD. So I'm back in Guyana now for 3 years later after the Lifebox episode that I related. And we have now established this residency training program there that Dr. Alex Harvey had envisaged. And I'm in the operating room as a foot soldier teaching anesthesia residents together with the faculty there. And we were doing a complex kidney transplant in the hospital in Georgetown. And we had the pulse oximeter there now because, of course, they came from Lifebox. But we didn't have an arterial line, a radial catheter that we used to monitor the blood pressure critically from second to second. And a patient with a kidney transplant has kidney disease, and this patient had malignant hypertension, a blood pressure that can swing greatly and could increase the mortality or morbidity from this procedure. But we didn't have the arterial line and monitoring device, which is a complex electronic device, in order to measure this accurately. So instead, I put into practice something that I'd learned in the University of Cape Town many years ago, which is just use a saline, a thin tube manometer. In essence, what you do is you just have a catheter which you raise above the patient's heart, fill it with saline, inject a little methylene blue so you can clearly see it, attach a tape measure, and then insert an arterial line in the radial artery and connect this manometer so that you can see the level of the water, which will then show you the blood pressure from second to second, as you would experience with a far more sophisticated electronic device. It works very well. And so we applied this, and it's one of those ideas that is what really makes anesthesia work. We often have to troubleshoot very simple problems or complex problems and have simple solutions for that. It's one of the beauties of anesthesia.
So I'm curious, whenever you made that recommendation for the manometer, how long had it been since you had done it previously?
Well, I hadn't done it for a very long time. And I have to tell you a story because, you may have heard of the blood pressure hitting the roof. Have you ever heard that term? Well, any anesthesiologist will know about this, but most don't know where it comes from. Well, it comes from these saline manometers. So the saline manometers would, they'd be colored with this methylene blue. And I tell this story in my book, Waking Up Safer, exactly the same kind of story. And what happens is, when the blood pressure shoots up for whatever reason, of course, it shoots out the top of the catheter and hits the ceiling. And so in this ICU that I worked in, you would literally have the blue methylene blue spots all over the ceiling from where the blood pressure had hit the roof. And that's where the whole idea comes from.
That's so interesting. So I'm not an anesthesiologist, so I haven't heard that phrase specifically, but I'm sure most of the people listening to this podcast are going to be connecting these dots.
Yeah.
So you've worked, a long time with a lot of different organizations, a lot of different doctors. Are there any others who are sort of your brothers in arms, so to speak, who are doing good work in this same space that you would want to highlight and maybe tell a few stories about some of the things that they're able to accomplish?
Yeah, so I would say, obviously, having worked with the World Federation, we are, in the business of uniting anesthesiologists around the world. There's about 500,000 of us around the world. And the World Federation is a federation of the societies of anesthesia around the world. So there's 130 societies of anesthesia. And so we represent them. The World Federation, of course, is particularly interested in building anesthesia capacity around the world, capacity and safety, and does this through multitudes of educational programs, as well as publications that champion education. For example, we have created in the order of 50 fellowships around the world. So what are fellowships? Fellowships are training opportunities for individuals from 3 months to a year in an adjacent neighboring country, so that they can return to their country of origin after having been trained in intensive care, in chronic pain management, in pediatric anesthesia, which is a dire need around the world because, as you know, a child, particularly a very young child, is a much more complex anesthetic to give. And so often we need to enhance people's training in this specialist area. So these programs are literally around the world, 50 of them a year, and that we've managed to build anesthesia capacity. So great work gets done through that. Then there's another organization, Health Volunteers Overseas, which I was the anesthesia director for 4 years, some 10 years ago. It is another group that actively seeks volunteers. So this, I think, is very important for your audience. Actively seeks volunteers who can help go to about 6 countries, again, volunteering their support, volunteering their anesthesia services and their expertise. So this is another very good organization to consider.
Excellent. Yeah. So as you're talking about the pediatric anesthesia need, I was thinking I have a couple friends who were doing some work. There's a training hospital in Kenya with Dr. Mark Newton from Vanderbilt.
Yes.
And I know they were doing, it sounded like a similar thing. They were there training some Kenyan physicians, and there were others from the African continent elsewhere that were there as well. And I remember them saying, I think it was Liberia, where there was a couple pediatric anesthesiologists there, and they were pretty much the only ones in the entire country with the pediatric training. And, you said there's 500,000 anesthesiologists in the world. I'm doing the math in my head. I think there's about 55,000 members of the ASA. So
Correct.
Obviously in the US, it's very dense. And it's a big world out there. We're 4% of the global population here in the United States. So it sounds like just from sheer number of anesthesiologists lacking elsewhere, that's a big part of the problem.
That's a very big part of the problem. And let me just pick up on 2 things there. Firstly, Mark Newton is a fantastic man. He's also part of the World Federation Society of Anesthesia, and also received the Global Humanitarian Outreach Award from the ASA GHO committee. We provide an award once a year to somebody who has made the largest impact on global health, and Mark Newton received that 2 years ago. Then just to give you a comparison, you said quite rightly the number of anesthesiologists here is in the order of 50,000 in the United States, and we have a population of this side of 300 million. Let's use that as an example. Let's move now to Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a population of 80 million people. It has, last count, 67 anesthesiologists.
Wow.
And about 400 nurse anesthetists that are trained through the Black Lion Hospital, and where I was talking about, we send people to as well. So that is one of the problems. The problem is that there aren't enough qualified people to give anesthetics around the world. And so this is what we call capacity building, step by step by step, setting up programs that allow people to be trained at all types of levels in order that they can give as safe anesthesia as possible.
Yeah.
Now, there's another very important statistic and trend, which is very concerning, and that is as the surgeons become more trained and more competent in, let's call it, low middle income countries, they are braver about doing particularly more complex surgery. The problem is that often the anesthesia capacity doesn't advance at the same time. And so while we see that surgical mortality is improving, anesthesia mortality is not improving at the same rate. In other words, there are just not the right number of individuals to provide the safe anesthesia, obviously, that the patients deserve. Yeah. And so that's another critical problem that we have to try and address.
Can you talk a little bit specifically how this relates to the OB anesthesia? Because I know childbirth, labor and delivery has its own sort of separate set of considerations. Talk about the your work in that context.
Yeah. So, the biggest concern there, of course, is that you have a mother and a child, and they're in labor. And so there's 2 lives to worry about. In many places around the world, the mother might go into something we call obstructed labor, so the baby can't come out. And the only solution we have is a C-section. And if you don't do a C-section, the mother dies from the labor and the baby does it, and then they both die. So a big problem around the world is that the laboring mother does not have access to either surgery and anesthesia, because you can't do the surgery without anesthesia. And so they just die. And the figures are something like 80,000 or more a year dying like this. And that's probably a low number compared to what's actually happening. So this is a crucial concern. And this is why the Lancet Commission pulls together surgical, obstetric, and anesthesia services that are needed around the world. So the statistics that I've been quoting you are for surgical, obstetric, and anesthesia requirements around the world.
Understood. So there's obviously a lot of work to be done. I'm sure there's
Yes.
probably people listening out there that are thinking, I want to maybe today or maybe tomorrow take a very practical first step to say, I want to do my part as an anesthesiologist or an anesthesia resident or fellow to start to either help in under-resourced areas or develop systems that can be replicated elsewhere so that we can train local physicians to be able to provide these very needed services.
Yeah.
If you had to give one or two very practical, here's something you can do today, here's a place you can go, here's an organization you can talk to, how would you direct somebody who's interested in that?
Well, I think, as I just said, Health Volunteers Overseas is a great opportunity to go to Health Volunteers Overseas because they are actively seeking volunteers. Then on our GHO website, we have what we call GHO alerts. So we post on there, and there, I just looked at it yesterday, there's a whole lot of alerts posted there for where people are critically needed. For example, we post on there that we need volunteers for our two programs in Rwanda and Guyana. And so that's another opportunity. But we keep posting at those sites. Then Operation Smile and Smile Train, two different organizations, are always seeking volunteers to provide anesthesia, particularly for cleft palates. So that's another opportunity. And then you can always provide donations to Lifebox or to the World Federation. We have a Fund the Fellow program. I just told you a little bit about the fellows. And of course, over time, you can try and get involved with the World Federation, of course, with our ASA GHO committee. Yeah. As you can imagine, our committee is well subscribed and a lot of people wish to be on it. Yeah. And so we try our very level best to accommodate those requests.
Excellent. So you just threw out a lot of great information. I'm going to make sure we capture all of that in the show notes. So anybody who's interested, anesthesiasuccess.com/41. We're going to have links to all these resources that Berend is referencing here, and would love to be able to make this as easy as possible for anybody who's wanting to really get involved to do so. Okay, well, I want to wrap things up here, Berend, and I really appreciate your time today. In closing, you are a man with vast experience, flying all over the place, training people in a bunch of different countries, doing clinical and administrative and systems work all over the globe. So I want to just close with a personal story. Take me to a moment when, you're focused, you're exerting, you're sacrificing a lot, and take me to a moment when things were transpiring in a way where you're able to reflect and say, all the work that I've put in, all the systems that I've been trying to construct, the people with whom I've been collaborating, in this moment, I see it working. I see some fruit being born, and it's really a beautiful thing to behold.
Yeah, I see that best in the smile of a global scholar who's been, to one of our programs. So the Global Scholars Program, the ASA, they come from a different country. They're selected, they rotate through a particular hospital, and then after that, they come to the ASA meeting. And they talk to me and they say, yeah, I'm inspired and I'm going to go home and I'm going to fix things. And that's when I realized that this is great, because I actually had that opportunity when I was in South Africa. I came to the States on a scholarship when I was a young resident. And, the importance of these things is letting individuals see how it can be. Mm-hmm. And so, we're very good here in the United States, and they get the opportunity to see how it can be. And so they can develop that vision for themselves or for their countries, and they can go back. And when I hear, for example, that one of our volunteers, our American volunteers in Guyana, is meeting with the Minister of Health in Guyana to help solve their problems, that puts a smile in my face, because then I know that we've started to connecting and making a real difference in that country, not just through the anesthesia, but for helping structure the efficiency and safety of surgical and anesthesia and obstetric services. So those are the moments that I look forward to.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Berend Mets, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you on the Anesthesia Success Podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
If you liked what you heard this week, head on over to anesthesiasuccess.com, where you can find more content and free resources to help you build a successful career in anesthesiology and pain management. If you wanted to leave a review in iTunes, I would also really appreciate it. Thanks for using some of your valuable time to join me today on the Anesthesia Success Podcast.